Cloud. So, thanks everyone for joining us today on what is the first research to practice webinar. Just a couple housekeeping things before we get into it. You'll all be on mute for now. If you did want to say something, maybe put up your hands and we can unmute you. If not, we can also get you to ask questions in the chat box as well. Today we can ask any questions that we may have. So the purpose of this webinar and the next couple of webinars is to really link the great research that's happening out there to what's happening on the ground level and what's happening in rugby in particular, and really encourage some off-season planning or pre-season planning for in the time that we're currently in. So we've got Dr. Jay Johnson here, who's a professor at the University of Manitoba. He's published extensively on hazing, and co-editing Making the Team Inside the World of Sport Initiations and Hazing with Dr. Margie Holmes. So I'm going to pass it over to Jay to maybe do a little bit of a longer introduction to himself and take us through some of the things that he's talking about on hazing. So Jay, over to you.
Well, thank you, Ryan. I guess I too wanted to welcome you all from my basement here in Winnipeg. I'm guessing this is our new world order. It's my first time actually doing something like this over Zoom. So if I have any technical glitches, I apologize in advance, but I'm suspecting that moving forward, this is the way it's going to be. They've actually told us here at the university that come fall, we're most likely not going to have any face-to-face classes. So we're going to have to figure out how to do it online, and all of these things too, like our meetings and our interactions, are probably going to be this way for a while too. So this is me trying to get used to it, and thanks for being a part of it. In terms of myself, I came to academia a little bit later. I taught high school and middle school for a little bit. In terms of my, I guess, sporting background, I was a wrestler, hockey player, and baseball player at fairly high levels. And then I became a triathlete a little bit later on in life, and about 30 pounds ago. But during that time, I was also an NCCP facilitator for coaches to get their certifications. And I also coached at the junior level in Ontario. I actually grew up in Southern Ontario and have only been out of the country for about, or not the country, the province, for about 12 years now. I taught in California for 5 years and the University of Windsor for a couple. And then actually I've been here almost 8 years now at the University of Manitoba. So I'm getting a little long in the tooth. This is a bit of a side story, but my first experience with rugby, because I'm old enough that I lived during at the time, the longest teacher strike in Ontario, which was, I believe, 13 weeks. I was in grade 11, and that was the year I was going to go out for rugby, because I was very small in grade 9 and 10, hovering around 100 pounds. I wrestled at 122 pounds. And then I grew a little bit and I was, intrigued by rugby. And of course, all of our sporting endeavors were canceled that year. But to come full circle, I actually ended up teaching back in my high school in 1994. And I had a group of female students that came to me, and they were desperate. I was the new teacher, and they needed like a teacher representative to, at least on the books, be their rugby coach, because they were trying to get their rugby team up and running. And of course I volunteered, knowing very little about the sport, but I learned a tremendous amount, not only about the sport itself, which is fantastic, but also about gender and sport too, which has really kind of shaped my academic journey. So I'm really happy to see, how it's proliferated over the years since 1994, and how many girls and women now are participating at all levels of the sport of rugby and in coaching as well. So I come to you today to talk about hazing in sport, something that I've been researching since I did my master's. I went through my own hazing on the wrestling team, which I'm happy to talk about if anyone wants to hear about it. but you probably know most of the stories anyways. I've been trying to not research hazing for the past 22 years, but unfortunately it's a topic that never seems to go away, right? Like, I look forward to the day when I'm not the one that they call when something like St. Mike's happens. So, but that being said, a lot of people probably have the preconceived notion that I'm critical of hazing or the rite of passage itself. And while I am very critical of certain elements of hazing because they flat out don't work, I'm actually really supportive of the rite of passage itself, and wanted to offer some suggestions today, if you're not already engaged with them, perhaps a bit of a pathway to doing something that from the athletes and the coaches' perspectives really truly builds team cohesion and unity, as opposed to potentially tearing the team apart. So in a nutshell, that's what I hope to capture. I really wanted to keep it quite informal. I do have a bit of a presentation on PowerPoint that I'm hopefully going to try and upload for you. That's based on a presentation that we gave to the Ontario Coaches Association, probably close to about a year ago. I remember seeing Ryan there. But all throughout, as Ryan indicated too, please feel free to ask questions at any point. If you want to stop, or you want me to expand on something, then feel free to do it. I also want to let you know that if you want, you can have a copy of the PowerPoints too. I've embedded some video links in there, and it elaborates a little bit more on some of the stories. If you wanted to learn a little bit more, I'm happy to share that through Ryan. And lastly, I really just wanted to give props to Ryan for putting this together. On a personal level, I've known Ryan since he was a student in one of my first classes. And not only is he an excellent student, academic, he's also a fantastic person. And I've been really happy to see him on this journey and how he's progressed into the working world and doing something innovative like this. And I'll unpack that a little bit later when I get into the presentation. Shouldn't be novel, but it really is. And I commend him for doing that. And the organization is only going to be stronger for it. So thanks to Ryan, and thanks for all of you to being here. And with that, I'm going to try and share this PowerPoint with you so we can dig into it. Here we go. Can you see that, Ryan?
Yeah, that's up.
So you can see Margie Holmes' name's on here too. I wanted to give her props because she has been with me. She's a retired professor from the University of Windsor, but she's been with me on this research journey from my PhD, I guess. And much of what we've done has been done together. And she's been an extremely gracious mentor for me and a great role model. So I just wanted to acknowledge too that her work and her participation is embedded in this presentation, but also on everything I'm going to present to you. So again, as I mentioned, feel free to flag us at any time and just throw a question out there if you want something. But in terms of what this presentation will hopefully be about is, I'm just going to share with you what I've learned through academics and through personal narratives and through some of my own stories too over the last 25 plus years. I want to focus specifically on the role of the coach, administrators, and to a certain extent, our athletes as well, and how they're positioned with regards to hazing and perhaps changing that culture. And lastly, I just wanted to offer some suggestions, again, coming out of some of my newer and some of my older research too, on alternatives that have really been effective in terms of working towards changing that culture, but making the experience a stronger and a better one for everyone involved. And then lastly, I want to open up to questions. So this slide is really a two-parter. One, it's to illustrate how pervasive hazing is throughout all of our subcultures. I've listed some here: military, fraternities, schools, and sports teams, but it extends beyond this too. It's one of the most practiced rites of passage in all of our cultures, actually across the world, but certainly here in North America, that marks our transition from one identity to another, or being welcomed onto a team in a very specific way. The second part is to point out one of the sticking parts whenever we have discussions around hazing, whether it's on an individual level or an academic level or even a discussion on a team. And it's what we call the grayness of hazing. And athletes in particular, their challenge in defining what they're doing as actually being hazing. And quite often, and I'm going to talk in the last half of this presentation about specific research we did across Canada and across sports. We looked at this too, and we're really a little bit astounded at the lack of maybe understanding, but acknowledgement of, you know, hazing, connecting those dots of what a team was doing in terms of their entry ritual, and you know, what is actually defined as hazing. And you can read it yourselves, but I just put up here what happened in reaction, right? A lot of universities or administrations or leagues, when we get high profile cases, one of the reactions is they develop policies, right? So we actually have pretty, I would say, well-defined policies, certainly across our universities and most of our sporting organizations, that are specific to hazing. So I just have some photos here that were lifted from hazing ceremonies. I realize that's traveling a little quick. At one point, these were actually a lot easier to find. I lifted many of these from websites where teams were freely posting what they were doing during their hazing initiations. And this wasn't that long ago. Actually, there was a website called the Dirty 30 where they would actually rank the photos linked to what, you know, a team was doing in terms of their hazing initiation. So I'm going to speak to, excuse me, some of the changes that we've seen. And this is one of them, is that it's become a lot more secretive and a lot more underground, so that we're not necessarily seeing firsthand, the public's not seeing necessarily firsthand, on purpose anyways, what's going on in the culture of teams or fraternities or the military. So when we look specifically at sport, surprisingly, there hasn't been many research studies done. There was one extensive one, and that's what this is based on, that came out of the NCAA, so university sport in the US. And they found that 80% of their athletes admitted to being hazed in some way. And of that number, only 20% self-described it as being a positive experience for them. So there's a large chunk of athletes in the US that are going through something to be welcomed onto the team that they're really not comfortable with, which in my mind is a large number. You can look too at the number that says 60% of high school students are also in a study reporting being hazed. And most of those, it's happening when they're around 12 or 13 years old. And that's actually going to link to what we found in our studies in Canada as well. So as I mentioned, I'm just giving you an overview now of three of the factors that we found in our study. And I'll elaborate on it a little bit. But these were the ones that stuck out for us. So when we did look at all of CIS sport and college sport across Canada in a survey, and then follow up one-on-one interviews with student athletes, coaches, and administrators or athletic directors, we found that 64% of athletes are admitting to going through some kind of a hazing. Of that group that responded or responded completely to the survey, 100% when they were in high school expected to be hazed when they came to university or to college. And that's a really important number and reality that we're going to talk about as well, because we're going to talk about age, the transitions that athletes go through, and the key points along development that we can address these issues too. And the last statistic, and I actually think it's a little bit misleading, and I'll talk about that later too, is that more female athletes were reporting being hazed than male athletes. So here's just a small list of some of the higher profile cases that we've seen that were hazing specific, that blew up in the media, and in most cases became some type of a court case. And I'm going to talk about some of the differences between the US and Canada, but probably all of you are familiar with the most recent, and I would describe as the highest profile case, which was St. Michael's College in Toronto, where athletes were sodomized with a broom handle repeatedly, and it was videotaped. So why is this unique? Because it certainly is not a unique scenario, although we tend to treat it that way, right? That this is a one-off and this was an isolated incident. If you followed this story, you saw alumni coming out and being interviewed that talked about the same practices happening 35, 40, 50 years ago. So there's a long-standing tradition, and tradition is something we're going to talk about too. But also, the modern reality that was unique to this was that it actually became a criminal case, and we saw criminal convictions of some of the youth, and they were under 18, so they are youth. They were found guilty. It's now become a large civil suit. A couple of the students haven't been able to return to school and have been traumatized by it, and that's at the heart of what the civil litigation is going to be about. So in terms of what's going on, I'll just skip through these because you can see that there's been higher payouts. The US tends to be more of a litigious country than we are here, and they've had more of the specific hazing related cases, particularly in sport, follow through and litigated. It's been very rare that there's been cases where the youth themselves were charged. It's usually the surrounding parties, the leagues, the administrators, the coaches, in some cases parents, that have been the ones that have, borne the brunt of the cases. McGill's an interesting, and again, I'll provide these PowerPoints with you so you can unpack it a little bit more if you want to see. But Darcy McEwen was a first-year football player at McGill in 2005. He's been outspoken. You've probably seen him on the media too, and he came back and spoke about his experiences when St. Mike's all happened as well in 2018. But essentially, part of the football initiation was being sodomized with a broom handle as well, in addition to other things. He actually had the fortitude to come forward in 2005 and essentially blow the whistle. The school responded. He switched schools. They came out with a zero tolerance policy, and I'm actually quite critical of zero tolerance policies because they're virtually ineffective, because it creates this void where nothing's being done. And as I mentioned in the introduction, one of the important things to have is your own tradition and your own ceremony to mark that rite of passage from, onto the team in this case. But where this comes full circle is they adopted this hardline stance, said that they were going into deep education, suspended the team, introduced alternatives, but apparently somewhere along the line, the message was lost or ignored because in 2017, they were also found guilty of hazing again. So in Canada, I would actually describe us as being a little bit behind, whereas in the States, and I pointed out some of the cases that they've had, every state except for 3, I think, have hazing specific legislation. So if there is an incident that happens on your team, it can be characterized as hazing and litigated as such. Canada, we really don't have that at any level of our governance. We don't have it at youth sports. Most leagues don't have hazing specific infractions. They might have hazing specific policies, but there's nothing specific to how do we regulate this from a legal aspect. So it usually falls under the umbrella of harassment, sexual harassment, abuse, or assault. So in my time researching this, what have we found? Well, really the best way to describe it is it fits into that grayness areas, right? Because we really see it as kind of a spectrum of things on one end of the spectrum that are positive and are effective and work, to some things that are a little bit more innocuous, to the far end of the spectrum too, where sexual, physical assault, psychological and emotional torment are the results of their hazing ceremony. That's what it's set up around. So the $1 million question, why do athletes continue to haze? Well, one of the things that I mentioned was this idea of tradition, right? Like it was done to us. Therefore, when I'm in a position of authority or seniority and I'm the veteran on the team, I get to do it to our incoming rookies. That was probably the most pervasive reason that's been given to me as a researcher over the years through all the interviews and all the surveys that we've done. And a lot of the times you can see I wrote down the degree of brutality and the cyclical nature of it. Unfortunately, I had a lot of athletes that would describe to me their glee with wanting to be in that position and spending the year dreaming up things that were even worse or more traumatic than what they had experienced because they relished being in that role. And a lot of that is connected to this idea of power and the hierarchy of a team as well, and getting your rookies in line and in lockstep with that, you know, top-down approach to how a lot of teams unfortunately are structured. Now that said, there are some positive changes that are happening. I've certainly seen changes over the past 20 years. I think there's, we've kind of hit that tipping point where I think most people get the message that hazing, however they're defining it, is unacceptable in the public sphere. Now that doesn't mean that it's not accepted within the sphere of sport. A lot of people understand that it's problematic and have taken steps towards changing that culture, but there are also a lot of us, unfortunately, as coaches and athletes that went through it and still recognize the value and want to keep at least some element or some core of that ceremony, and are reluctant to completely let it go because we feel that it's tied to some element of our success. I also think that some athletes feel more in a position where they actually can stand up against it, although not in all cases. They still tend to be the ones that are marginalized, right, or ostracized from the team, or ultimately leave the teams too, because they're the ones that do say, I don't want to do this. So what are some of the recommendations that we've come to when we kind of siphon through all of our research? Well, the first thing is you've got to break that cycle. If you think of it as a cycle of violence, then you have to break that cycle of violence, right? You need students involved. Most importantly, you need coaches and leadership on the team involved. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that specifically that came out of our study too. Because what's happened over the years is when this became more of an issue, a public issue, a lot of coaches unfortunately put blinders on and distanced themselves from it. And we're telling their coaches or their teams for the most part, you know, the right things, what not to do. But sometimes they were winking at their teams at the same time. Policies we talked about, support, and quite often administrative support means funding, means education, but also funding for doing things in a different way. And that's what we call alternative initiations. And I'm going to give you some examples of that later on, but it's certainly not an exhaustive list. Also, one of the things that is lacking from most administrations, even if they do have a policy, there's no clearly defined sanctions or way to get at sanctioning a team. Like, what are the procedures from getting from here, breaking the policy, to being sanctioned for breaking the policy? A lot of organizations don't have that mechanism in place. Excuse me. So the next handful of slides are based on our last major SSHRC-funded study that ended in 2018, where we surveyed teams regardless of gender, regardless of sport played, all across the country. And it was two parts. One was quantitative, where they filled out the survey online, and the second was qualitative, where we reached out directly to talk to coaches, administrators, and athletes. So what did we find? Well, some interesting things. There's still a lot of layers in that hierarchy to actually getting to have conversations or access to athletes or student athletes. And that's what we call the Gatekeeper Effect. For this study, first of all, we had to go through the governing bodies, which we understand. Then you have to go through the athletic directors or, you know, the conveners of the leagues, which I understand. But then you have to go through the coaches, and then, you know, maybe they're the ones that share the information with the athletes and maybe not. Usually at some point along that way, you know, someone turned a blind eye or just did not pass the information along because they didn't feel it had value or whatever the reasons were. So it's actually quite difficult to get to student athletes. We put here 1,000 people started the survey only about 450 finished it. Now, we have to read into that result, and we actually think that a lot of athletes started, but once they got into it, they started to realize what they were doing was hazing related and opted out of the survey. So some of our numbers we think are low because of that. You know, they, even though it was anonymous, they opted out at some point along the way. And I also think that that's one of the reasons that we had more female athletes responding than male athletes, that they were going through hazing, because I think there's still that reluctance to, one, identify it as hazing for sure, but also to admit that what you're doing, even under the cloak of anonymity, you know, that you're hazing your incoming athletes. So the third point down, the nuanced understanding not to speak of hazing, that's one of the changes we've seen over time too, from, you know, the era where teams were open about it, sharing their stories with other teams, sharing their stories with families, to now it's something that we don't talk about, right? So we actually develop different language around it. Well, we're having a rookie party or we're doing an initiation, and we describe it as being a fun, positive activity for all those involved. We also saw a real movement away from, you know, coaches, administrators, and all of those other people seeing or hearing about what teams are doing. So it's happening more in secrecy. This surprised us a little bit. We were still seeing the same kinds of activities going on. You know, it revolved around drinking, which is problematic on one level, right? Because for a lot of the first year athletes who can be 16 turning 17, this is their first experience with alcohol or drinking. Not for all of them, but for some. And typically the drinking games involve, as you know, drinking to excess, vomiting is a part of it, just getting them as wasted in as short a period of time as possible. It also breaks down their inhibitions, right, to maybe do some of the things later on during the ceremony that they wouldn't necessarily be agreeable to. Nudity was still a part of it. You know, sexualized hazings were still a part of it, despite sort of more of a public awareness and knowledge of, you know, what's acceptable and what's not. Still shaving of body parts, you know, eyebrows and haircuts. I went to school with an OHL team, and inevitably the rookies would show up, you know, with no eyebrows and half a head of hair. So I mentioned this in the introduction too. One of the most important things we found is that to a person, all of the athletes are coming in expecting to be hazed. So there is some mechanism at play where our teens or younger either are being initiated or going through hazing or have knowledge of it. So by the time they get to university or college, they're expecting that something's going to happen. So there is a mechanism that's passing that message back or that practice back as well. One of the changes we've seen too is the last point here, that a lot of the policies and a lot of the directives coming from leagues involve this idea that you absolutely, as an individual athlete on a team, have the option to say no and to back out of anything that you don't feel comfortable doing. But as we all know too, having been on teams, is that person is often picked on or marginalized for not wanting to be a part of the team and doing what they're being asked. So one of the other big findings that we found is gradually over time, coaches have drifted away where once they were actually a part of whatever the hazing ceremony was, they drifted away from being a central part of it. Well, we actually had the athletes expressing the desire to have the coaches to become back into a part of that tradition and that ceremony. So athletes were telling us that they would feel more comfortable if their coaches were there and were a part of it. Unfortunately, you can see here too that what was being described to us is just, unfortunately, a lot of lip service in terms of administrations truly addressing the issue of hazing and educating their athletes and coaches. And again, the most important part on this is even when there is a discussion around hazing on a team, it's really kind of fuzzy or hazy as to what, first of all, defines what hazing is. If we cross that line, how do we know it? And most importantly, if that comes out, and when you read into the media cases, you know, when it's inevitable that all of the athletes that are interviewed in the media when they've been caught hazing, is that none of them felt bad about what they were being asked to do. It was a positive experience, and none of them saw it as hazing. They saw it as their rookie night or a rookie party, and that's it. So that's really where the disconnect between where there's more of a legal definition and what in some cases what teams are doing and not knowingly hazing, but being caught and sanctioned as a result. So a lot of those elements need to be clearly established too. Not only established, but discussed. So lastly, going back to my PhD, I wanted to look at ways that we could introduce some kind of a variable that I call an alternative to get teams to move away from more traditional marginalizing types of hazing ceremonies, but keep all those good elements that we talk about, right? Like bonding, cohesion, relationship building, communication, you know, and ultimately that equating to success. So how do we move away from the more problematic hazing, introduce an alternative, and achieve, you know, those goals that we think in some cases hazing is achieving? So my biggest, a big part of my background is being involved in outdoor adventure-based programming and education. So I use that as the variable to introduce an alternative, but it's not limited to this. This is just one of many, and I'll explain in a second, but most of these ideas should be coming from the team anyways. This just happened to be a personal passion of mine and something I had experience with, and, you know, it ended up being successful. I worked with over 700 athletes and different teams, and we did, you know, like the weekend canoe trips, or we did high ropes courses, low ropes courses, climbing towers. And then we measured afterwards, you know, whether they felt it was effective, and overwhelmingly, athletes and coaches said, yeah, this really did help. And not only did it help in the short term when I spoke to them shortly after the experience, it helped in the longer term too. You know, I went back in 6 months and the following season and asked some similar questions about how it played out over the course of their year or their season. And they could always trace it back to what they did as a group, you know, to that orientation, and marked it as being really effective way to achieve all of those things that I outlined before. So that said, like, it's not an exhaustive list. For it to be effective, it really has to come from the team, because we're talking about long-standing traditions of hazing in a lot of cases, and that has come from the team, you know, those ideas. So it still has to be developed by the team in conjunction with one another, if you're going to shift away from hazing. But you're creating new traditions too, right, moving forward. And that's going to include the coaches, because that's one thing that everyone said they really needed to see. Now, what worked about, you know, the outdoor adventure activities is this idea that there still had to be an element of challenge and risk experienced by the athletes. You know, sometimes we're rappelling off of cliffs, you know, blindfolded, and, you know, not everyone's comfortable with heights, right? Or you're walking a wire that's 30, 40 feet off the ground as well. So that was important, particularly for male teams, but for all athletes, that there's some type of a challenge. But that said, it doesn't have to always involve that risk. You know, some teams have reported back to us that they did, they went and volunteered at like a homeless shelter and cooked for 3 nights or 3 days and found that really effective. Did charity raising, sometimes even team dinners, right? And playing games together, providing a space and an opportunity for people to get to know each other. So with that, I certainly thank you, and I just wanted to open it up to the group to see if you had any questions, specific questions you wanted to ask, and I'll do my best to try and answer them.
Yeah, sounds good. So thanks, Jay. Thanks for that. And I think if you can type in the Zoom group chat on any questions that you have, and we can answer them. So we've got one come through here. So through your research, what activities have been most common that would be labeled as divisive? So
yeah, well, that's a great question, you know, because I mean, I can give you some specific answers, but it's also specific to the individual, right? So for some people, it can be on the milder end, like being asked constantly to always put the equipment away, or to always have to wash or be responsible for, you know, the veterans equipment. To the extreme end, you know, probably the most are with male teams with anything that involved sexualized behavior. I remember I was on a call-in show maybe 10 years ago, and it was a trucker calling in who had been a hockey player. And it was 25 years after it had happened to him. And basically what he said is, I wish I could get my hands on those guys, even 25 years later, to do what I want to do to them, which is, you know, enact violence, right? Like, it's still so raw and visceral. That probably at the core, that will have the longest lasting effects. Anything that's rooted in sexuality or nudity. I've had some good hockey and rugby ones described to me. The elephant walk is pretty common. You know, running into cafeterias naked, having to be lined up according to penis size, things like that. Just meant to humiliate and degrade. Yeah, I mean, I think the best thing that you can do is to have an open discussion with your group or your team, and to see what everyone's going to feel comfortable with. So the most honest kind of a landscape you can make, you know, for yourself and your team to speak openly and honestly about it, you can come up with some pretty great ideas together that most likely won't be, you won't have to suss out, you know, somewhere along that spectrum what might cause either immediate harm or, you know, long-term harm. You know, I gave an example of rappelling. Well, one of the coaches that was involved was so terrified of rappelling that, you know, he couldn't go through it. And there was another that was, I would say, just as terrified, but had her athletes talk her through it. And she talked about that experience on the other side, you know, sort of overcoming a personal fear and having others involved with it as being really transformative for her as a coach and a human being, actually. But you're potentially putting people in positions that they really don't want to be. But that's what I call sort of regulated or controlled risk, because you have guides there, you have training on how to use, you know, the rappelling ropes and whatnot. So it's just dealing sort of with the psychological side of it too.
And I think building on this as well. So what themes would you recommend to give to a group of team leaders to maybe steer them towards a productive rite of passage ceremony or activity?
Well, I think it starts actually in communication, and I think it actually starts in that discussion, right? And that's where you can kind of marry the idea of education and building something together at the same time. Because if you're talking honestly about it, right, then there's nothing to hide. If you feel there's something that you have to hide, then that's probably the first indication that there's an issue with what you're doing or thinking about doing. So that's where I would start. And we've done these seminars with individual teams, or these sessions, sorry, or even with like larger groups of teams and coaches over the years. And that's where we start with, is just getting all the stories out and then working over time to create that atmosphere and that environment where, you know, there is more honesty shared and people feel more comfortable. because that's going to, you know, from having coached, that's going to translate over time to a better relationship rooted in communication with you and your athletes, and the athletes with each other as well, if that's kind of the precedent that you're setting. And as a coach, you're coming to them, you know, with the genuine respect and idea that you want to do something that you believe in, that's going to build a stronger team, a better, more competitive team, a better communicating team, and a better bonded team. So that's really where I think it starts with. And then over time, those ideas will be generated from within. You know, and there's certainly, I think Ryan provided you with our toolkit, which has a whole list of suggestions that have come from teams over time. And those are just things that have worked for them. But, you know, it's only limited to your ideas and kind of that group input.
Yeah, and I'll share that toolkit out with everybody as well after this.
Sure.
So, in terms of examples, so where have you seen some of the sort of good programming, and what did that look like? What did those initiation processes look like?
Well, it's been random because usually it's driven by an individual that's invested in this. So in some cases, it's been an athletic director that really wanted to work closely with changing the culture with their sports administrative teams, you know, and their coaches. So the University of Windsor with Mike Havey, I would say, has been very proactive. But that said, you know, you can't micromanage every minute of every day of what a team is doing, right? So, but they have put true, all of the elements we talked about, you know, education policies, sanction, and support and funding for. In fact, they built a ropes course on campus that does get used by some of the teams too. So they've been really good. I go back to when I was a master's and PhD student at the University of Toronto. Christine Drakic is the women's volleyball team coach, has been for now over 20 years, I guess. And from the get-go, she's always been very proactive with doing something specific with her team, so involved as a coach, but also working in conjunction with her team leaders and the first-year players to develop some kind of a welcoming ceremony that they do together, because she's always bought into it. Ken Olynyk, too, who was the former basketball coach at the University of Toronto, their son plays in the NBA, was in Boston. I can't remember what team now, but he actually took part as a young kid in one of our outings, which was fun. Kelly was his name. He was proactive with his team too. He really believed in it, bought into it. And that's where the spark has to come from, the leadership on the team, whether that's, you know, from the league on down, or Ryan, you've always been very proactive too. I think you're a good example in all of this. But I guess my final answer is that it's more widespread, and it's really, as opposed to an entire program, it's always based on the individual, or on an individual or group of individuals on a team wanting to do something different. Because a lot of leagues or governing bodies, you know, will have some of those issues in place, like maybe they have an education program, but most likely they have a policy and maybe some rough guidelines for sanctioning. But beyond that, you know, they don't have the other elements. So when something happens, inevitably, right, they're always kind of caught with their pants down to a certain extent.
Just another question around, we talked a little bit about the difference between male and female teams. Maybe if you can just expand a little bit on that, like what have you seen in terms of you know, what does typical hazing practice look like comparing between the genders?
Sure. Well, I mean, I can go back to, you know, the story I shared with you back in '94 when you know, women's rugby was just getting started. It was the same with women and girls hockey. So we've had a relatively new entry into certain sports with women's teams and with girls now. And it's great to see that growth and development, right? Rugby and women's hockey, women's rugby and women's hockey are the fastest growing sports in a lot of ways in terms of membership, right? Because those doors have opened. So what we saw when we first started researching this, because of that newness, was that a lot of women's teams were, one, hanging out with the men's teams, but also adopting those same practices that the guys' teams were doing, when maybe it was a good opportunity to take things in a different direction, right? So over time, we've seen a lot more overlap between what men's and women's teams are doing. And in certain cases, certainly when you get to, you know, university, some sports become co-ed, right? Like track and field and swimming. So they would be doing things together, which were highly sexualized as well.
Right.
Some of the main differences, I would say, is that men's hazing ceremonies tended to be, one, more violent, physically violent towards each other. In most cases involve more nudity and more sexualized nudity. So following through with sexual acts or being engaged in sexual acts, where there was some cases where we heard of nudity on women's teams and sexualized games, but not to the same extent. So maybe performing fellatio on bananas in front of the team, being covered in whipped cream and one of the other athletes having to lick it off, describing sexual fantasies or experiences on women's teams versus, you know, like group masturbation on slices of pizzas. Like I said, the elephant walk too is a popular one with hockey teams, to being sodomized with broom handles, right? So we don't hear quite that level of sexual violence with women's teams. So I would say that those are the main two differences.
And so what is it that that typically happens in the women's environment?
Well, what binds all of them together is alcohol in almost 100% of cases. So there's a lot of drinking that goes on. Women's teams would still involve things like having to wear either shirts covered with, you know, sexualized graffiti or just graffiti, or it directly on their body, and then, you know, having to go to their classes dressed like that or wearing that. What else is a popular one? There's still shaving eyebrows in some cases, although I haven't heard of that one in a little while. But having more parties and getting the first year players pretty inebriated. Maybe having to go to a bar and get 10 numbers from different guys, something like that.
Right. So we've got one last question here, and then I think we'll look to wrap it up. So what are some behavioral signs as a new coach can look for that a cultural change is needed? So we've got a new coach coming into an environment. What are some things we can look for to identify that there's a cultural change needed?
So that's a great question too, because well, I think the first thing that you could do as a new coach is have that discussion beforehand. You know, what I think is so brilliant about what you're doing here, Ryan, is I've given a lot of these talks over the years, but it's always in reaction to an incident happening, right? And not that it's too late, but it's happening after the fact, where I think we should always be sort of moving in a preventative way, where this is a part of that. So I do applaud you for that. I think a coach, you know, being a coach is no different. You can have these frank and open discussions up front, you know, and what I found is, you know, coaches that come down hard and deliver that zero tolerance policy, you know, it's not to happen here, doesn't stop it from happening. It just means that the team is going to work really hard to keep that from, you know, the coach knowing. But then when I would press the athletes a little bit more and say like, well, how's your coach not know, right? And they said, yeah, they know, because half of us show up hungover, you know, the night after for our practice, or, you know, yeah, something shaved off of us, or there's some writing on our bodies that, you know, you can't completely get off. And there's also more of a, because it's something that you went through together, it does bond you in a way. Even when it's something that's more problematic, you know. So there's quite often discussions and, hey, remember when, you know, or, you know, Stephanie was really out of control last night. There's things like that that you can be listening for too. You know, the conversations between athletes, behaviors, and in extreme cases, because everyone I talked to could always point at this one person as being the person that slowly over time ended up leaving the team. And it's usually because of something that either happened during the hazing ceremony or because they chose to not participate, to not go. And if you notice sort of an athlete that's drifting, you know, or is being ostracized or picked on by the other players, there's a good chance that it could be related back to that. I mean, it could be other factors too, but I've certainly have heard that story over and over again.
That's great. So if there aren't any more questions to come through, I think we'll wrap it up here. And so I'll pass it over to you in a second to maybe give a final some final words. But I think for me, my biggest takeaway that you said over and over again is to really involve the athletes in the discussion and talk to each other. And I think when I go back to some of the teams that I work with and in those environments, it'll be to sit down and have that talk on how do we want to welcome everybody to the team with the leaders from the previous year, and really make sure that we're creating an environment that everybody feels welcome. So thank you very much for taking the time. You've obviously I've known you for quite a while and been a mentor of mine. So really appreciate you doing this for us, and I'll pass it over to you for any kind of final thoughts.
Well, thanks a lot for that, Ryan. I couldn't have said it any better. And I just wanted to let everyone know that we've got a lot of resources. You know, we do this because we really do want people to engage with it. We have resources to share with you. You know, take it for what it is. Use it however you want. There's no fees attached to it. And if you wanted to reach out to me personally, obviously my email address is on the screen there. I'm happy to have conversations with you, and you know, if I can offer anything, you know, that would be fantastic. So thanks everyone. This was a little less painful than I expected it to be. So here's to the future.
That's great. Okay. Thanks, Jay, and thanks everyone else. And we'll catch up with you soon. We're on with Amanda Visick on Thursday to talk about fund mapping and some of the work that she's done. And why kids play sport. So thanks and take care. Talk to you soon. Thanks, Jay.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. See you later.